The federal budget and tax reform are high on the agenda here in D.C. Can Congress get something passed to benefit the American people? CNBC senior contributor Larry Kudlow will update us. And later, the Christians and Yazidis continue to suffer in Iraq. Are U.S. aid policies actually hurting these beleaguered communities? Director of the Center for Religious Freedom, Nino will tell us. And finally, Justice Antonin Scalia's untimely death deprived the U.S. Supreme Court of one of its most original legal minds. Now, more than a year later, a new collection of his speeches give new insight into the man and his legal contributions. Editors of Scalia Speaks, the Justice's son, Chris Scalia and Ed Whelan will join us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Larry Kudlow, Nino, Chris Scalia, and Ed Whelan are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. Or you can email us at worldover@EWTN.com. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. Investigators are still looking for answers in the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Stephen Paddock killed 58 people and injured some 500 more on Sunday in Las Vegas when he shot into a crowd of thousands at a country music festival from his 32nd floor perch at the nearby Mandalay Bay Hotel. In the immediate hours following the tragedy, Democrats renewed their call for gun control, targeting both Republicans and the National Rifle Association for blocking measures to restrict gun ownership. President Donald Trump met with victims, doctors, and first responders in Vegas on Wednesday. He commended all involved for their hard work and bravery.
The example of those whose final act was to sacrifice themselves for those they loved should inspire all of us to show more love every day for the people who grace our lives. In the months ahead, we will all have to wrestle with the horror of what has unfolded this week, but we will struggle through it together. We will endure the pain together, and we will overcome together as Americans. May God bless and watch over those who protect us. May God bring healing to the families of the wounded, the injured, and the fallen. And may God bless our great country, America. Thank you very much.
And the long road to recovery continues in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Maria. President Trump met with Puerto Ricans and surveyed hurricane damage on Tuesday. He praised federal responders and congratulated locals for avoiding a high death toll like that of Hurricane Katrina. The official count of those who have died in Hurricane Maria stands at 34. Nearly 2 weeks after the Category 4 storm made landfall, 95% of the U.S. territory remains off the power grid, and about half the island is still without clean water. More than 10,000 federal officials are on the ground assisting in the recovery effort. Keep them in your prayers. The Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives this week. The measure would ban most abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy, except to save the life of a mother or in cases of rape or incest. The Republican-led measure passed largely along a party-line vote, save for 3 Democrats. The White House issued a statement Monday applauding the House for continuing in its efforts to secure critical pro-life protections. The bill now awaits consideration in the Senate, where it is expected to be filibustered by Democrats. And Catalonia is on the verge of separating from Spain after an overwhelming referendum in favor of secession on Sunday. Catalonia's regional government is considering when to declare independence in the wake of a disputed referendum that has triggered Spain's most serious national crisis in decades. Madrid says the referendum is illegal and invalid and has been bitterly opposed to any move for independence. Spain's national government used security forces to try to stop Catalonians from casting votes. The confrontation turned violent as some 800 people were wounded, according to officials. Church leaders condemned the violence as deplorable. Cardinal Juan José Omea of Barcelona urged that a peaceful and democratic way out of the situation be found. And Maronite Patriarch Cardinal Bashara al-Rahi says that the Syrian refugee situation in Lebanon has become unbearable. More than 1.5 million refugees have fled Syria to the neighboring country since the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011. Cardinal al-Rahi said that Lebanon must not wait for the international community, but should exert strenuous efforts to return the displaced to safe regions in Syria. The refugee influx into Lebanon has strained the country's infrastructure and has also sparked accusations that refugee camps are harboring militants from the war. And Boko Haram's ongoing insurgency in northern Nigeria has forced the closure of more than half of the schools in the region, leaving about 3 million children without a means of education. This according to the United Nations Children's Fund. Nearly 2,300 teachers have been killed by Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria since 2009, and nearly 1,400 schools have been destroyed. Across Nigeria, more than 10 million children are not in school. Pope Francis has reappointed Cardinal Raymond Burke to the Apostolic Signatura in Rome, the Vatican's highest canonical court. The Pope made the surprise announcement this past weekend. You'll recall that Pope Francis removed Cardinal Burke as head of the Signatura in 2014, who until a few months ago served as patron of the Knights of Malta. Following the announcement, the National Catholic Register's Edward Penton reported that Burke's assignment is only part-time, allowing him to serve as a judge on the court when needed. Cardinal Burke has been the prime mover in the dubia, or questions submitted to the Pope, asking for clarification of teachings related to his apostolic letter Amoris Laetitia. According to Cardinal Burke, this new appointment will not change or delay his plans for a formal correction of Pope Francis should the dubia continue to go unanswered. We'll keep watching this story. And at his regular Wednesday audience on October 4th, Pope Francis invited young people from around the world to meet in Rome early next year to discuss the topic for the next Synod of Bishops. The meeting next October will focus on youth and vocational discernment. But in advance of that meeting, in late March of 2018, the Pope will bring together young Catholics, other Christians, and even non-believers to get their input in advance of the Synod. Now, according to Pope Francis, the Church wishes to, quote, listen to the voices, feelings, faith, and even the doubts and critiques of the youth, end quote. We'll certainly keep our eyes on that development. When we return, can the Trump tax reform plan make it through Congress? And what about balancing the budget? CNBC's Larry Kudlow will tell us. When the World Over continues, we'll listen to his critiques and feelings and doubts as well. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. Can lawmakers pull together a comprehensive tax reform package and pass a budget amidst the chaos caused by a series of natural disasters? Here with analysis is CNBC senior contributor Larry Kudlow, who joins us from New York. Thanks for being with us, Larry.
Thank you, Raymond. Appreciate it.
Now, the top 1%, Larry, pays 43.6% of federal taxes, and almost 45% of Americans pay no taxes at all. So who exactly is benefiting by this GOP plan to lower taxes for the middle and lower incomes?
Well, just one correction when you say the bottom group doesn't pay any taxes. If you're working, they pay Social Security taxes. That's very important. Now, who benefits from this plan? Let me just make this point. Everybody is going to benefit from this plan. You know why? Because the economy is going to grow at 3 to 4% over the longer term, which is America's natural rate of economic growth. This is exactly the right tax plan, particularly lowering business taxes for large and small companies, which will help investment and productivity and wages. Everyone is going to benefit from this plan, and I can't stand all this stuff about rich people and non-rich people. That kind of class warfare never works in the United States. Never works.
But the president himself is raising taxes on the upper income. These are the people who create the businesses and sustain the wealth engines for the country. So doesn't that retard growth, Larry Kudlow?
Why do you say he's raising taxes on the upper end?
Well, he said he may even include another tax category up top.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. Look, there are a lot of options here. Let me note, by the way, for upper income people, their marginal tax rate, which is roughly 40%, a little above that, may or may not come down, okay? It may or may not come down. I don't know. I don't think that's the most important thing in this package, okay? I just don't. The president does want to abolish the inheritance tax, the so-called death tax. That's going to help investment. That's going to help family businesses and wealthy people, okay? He wants to get rid of the alternative minimum tax. That's a good move for everybody across the board in terms of simplicity and tax reduction. Again, if you own your own business, if you have a pass-through, if you have a wholly owned company, you're going to get a big tax break from about 40% down to 25%. Public companies are going to get a tax cut from 35% down to 20%. Foreign cash, multinational cash overseas will be repatriated at a low 10% rate. Investment by businesses will be expensed immediately. I mean, it doesn't get any better than this, for heaven's sakes. And you're not going to have a total reform package. We don't have time for that, but we have time for the essentials that will boost economic growth. And Raymond, you know, if growth increases, everyone benefits. A rising tide lifts all boats.
Okay, I want to challenge you on one point. The president wants to lower those corporate taxes, as you mentioned, from 35 to 20%. Here's the problem, Larry. In 2004, when this was attempted, many of these corporations, they brought the money back, they bought stock back with it, and there was very little economic ingenuity or movement because of it. What's to stop that from happening again?
Well, by the way, in defense of the Bush tax cuts, you did have a 5 or 6 year economic rebound. That's point number one.
Okay.
Point number two, I have no problem. If companies buy their shares back, then the shareholders get the cash. And they will then invest the money someplace. They're not going to put it under mattresses. They may start new businesses with that. So why do we worry about such things? Now, mind you, this bill is much larger on the business side than anything George W. Bush proposed. And I think that makes this a completely different animal. But why do I care? If I'm a shareholder, which I am, and you're going to give me the cash, then I'll go out and invest it. I might start a new company. I might help a new company. Who knows? Why is that important?
Well, it's important because people want new jobs. You want new investment in the economy. I mean, that's the idea, to raise all ships, not to kind of have 4 people hoarding it away in their safes at home. I mean, that's the fear here, right?
Well, it's 4 people. There's no hoarding, Raymond. That was in the 1930s. People used to put cash under the mattress. That's a different era completely. I agree. Putting money in a mattress doesn't make any sense. I guarantee you, in this bull market, shareholders are not going to put their money under a mattress. That money is going to be recycled. As I said, think of it this way. You might reinvest it in other shares. You might reinvest it in the shares of brand new companies, right? IPOs, which would be a good thing. Or you might give it to your brother-in-law or your uncle to start a new company, which will employ people. But the most important thing is we will be competitive with the rest of the world. Dropping from 35% to 20% is a 23% increase in incentive rewards. That's a huge increase. And if you believe in the supply side model and you think incentives matter and you're increasing the return on capital investment, which we need to do, then this is exactly what the doctor ordered. And by the way, let me add one more point.
Oh, we'll add another thing,
Lower
Larry.
business taxes help wage earners.
Okay.
Lower business taxes, listen to me, lower business taxes help the middle-class wage earners the most. Roughly 70% of the benefits of a corporate tax cut go to the wage earners. That's an important factoid. That's another reason why this is a middle-class tax cut.
Larry Kudlow gets practically evangelical when he talks about this tax plan. Okay, I got to get this in. The Tax Policy Center, Larry, they claim that this current plan will actually raise the tax rate on the lower rungs of the income ladder by 10 to 12%. How is this helping the middle class?
Well, first of all, ask yourself, are they right?
Right.
The answer is they're wrong.
Okay.
The answer is
why?
They're using numbers from last spring, which are not going to be the numbers used. We don't even know what the tax brackets are going to look like.
Right.
We don't even know yet what the tax credits. This is a crowd which purports to be bipartisan, but is not. They're the ones who slammed Mitt Romney's tax plan unfairly. Now they're blaming Donald Trump's tax plan. This is not a group that can shoot straight. By the way, a much more honest group, the Tax Foundation, argues that 80% of the direct benefits, 80% will go to the lowest group, and only 20% will kind of break even. The top 20% will probably have a little higher tax burden. The bottom 80% will have a lower tax burden. None of that matters. What matters is incentives. What matters is after-tax returns. What matters is take-home pay, more money in your pocket. This class warfare stuff, Raymond, you got to get this out of your head. You got to completely erase this from your mind. Class warfare doesn't work. This is about growth. This is about growth, not redistribution.
I told you he was evangelical on this. Okay, I want to switch topics for a moment. When asked about committing to rebuild Puerto Rico this week, the president had this to say. Listen.
We have to look at their whole debt structure. You know, they owe a lot of money to your friends on Wall Street, and we're going to have to wipe that out. That's going to have to be, you can say goodbye to that. I don't know if it's Goldman Sachs, but whoever it is, you can wave goodbye to that.
Larry Kudlow, your reaction to the president's, it seems he wants to wipe the debt of Puerto Rico away. Now, Mick Mulvaney, his budget chief, says that's not exactly what he's saying. You would say what?
I would say Mulvaney clarified this. Look, you've got bankruptcy laws for states and municipalities. You can't just forgive the debt. We have the Fifth Amendment, so-called the takings clause.
Right.
You have to remunerate people on defaults and so forth. I think the president got ahead of himself. What Mulvaney is saying, and he's a sharp-eyed budget guy, he's saying, look, we are going to provide as much financial assistance to bail out Puerto Rico's hurricane situation. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do whatever it takes to get Puerto Rico back on its feet. But regarding their long-term debt problem, this is a badly mismanaged territory, very badly mismanaged. That is another matter, and separate books are going to be kept between the bankruptcy proceedings and the emergency assistance.
Who's going to pay for all of this, Larry? I mean, the Congress has a budget they're working on now, but between Florida and Texas and now Puerto Rico, that's a lot of bailout. That's a lot of natural disaster for one fiscal year.
Well, look, this is a generous country. America is a generous country. And when these emergencies come, we do what we have to do to take care of them and get folks, states, municipalities, territories back on their feet. That's what America has always been about. But let me add this point, coming back to your early assertions and questions. Economic growth makes this possible. An economy that's not growing can never afford to help those really in need. And my point here is, think about tax incentives. Think about more investment. Think about higher productivity and wages. That's what gives America the strength to help in these terrible emergency situations. And we have done it in the past, and we will do it again.
Give me your sense of this tax bill as you look at it, as it begins to take shape in the House and soon the Senate. There has been such a lack of coordination between the House and the Senate leadership. Is this tax reform plan or these tax cuts proposed by the president Are they going to go the way of the Obamacare repeal?
No, I don't think so. I think you have a pretty unified GOP. I mean, remember, this so-called group of six, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, 2 from the White House, they've been meeting for many months, and they have already shown you a framework of what's going to come out of their final deliberations. So I think the party is much more united. I think there are issues remaining, some difficult issues. We will see them, by the way, next week coming out of the Senate Budget Committee. Very, very important. We need a budget resolution, and that's got to have tax instructions for a 51-vote reconciliation plan. So we don't know those details yet, but I think the GOP is really bound and determined to get this pro-growth tax cut through.
Just before I let you go, the House voted this week to restrict abortions after 20 weeks of gestation, Larry. This now goes to the Senate. I'm already hearing from people in the Senate, it's going to be filibustered. It's not going to go anywhere. Why can't the leadership in this party get its act together and move these things that are critical and important to their base?
Well, look, I'm a pro-life guy, as you know, and I support the limits to abortion. I mean, I'm completely pro-life. Yeah. I think life is conceived right away. So I wish it would get through the Senate. I really do. I would get rid of filibusters entirely on all subjects. I think it's some kind of 19th century artifact. It doesn't make any sense. That's a different subject about legislative process. Yeah. Regarding abortions, I'm against abortions. I hope it passes the House, and I wish some senators would stand up on the floor and really support this. 20 weeks, even 20 weeks is too much if you ask me, Raymond.
Well, I think a lot of people would agree with you. Larry KUDLOW, thank you for being here. His book, JFK and the Reagan Revolution, is still available at bookstores everywhere. We always love having you on Larry. You can follow Larry on Twitter at Larry_KUDLOW. Up next, religious minorities suffered greatly under ISIS in Iraq. So why are they getting none of the $1 billion appropriated by Congress for them? Director of the Center for Religious Freedom, Nino SHEA, is here to tell us why. When the World Over continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Under ISIS occupation in Iraq, Christians and Yazidis faced persecution and a bloody genocide. In the wake of ISIS's defeat, Congress appropriated some $1.4 billion for refugee relief. So why is none of it going to the Christians or the Yazidis? Here with analysis is the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, Nino SHEA. Nino, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I wish it were under happier circumstances. What we're learning is that apparently the State Department just appropriated $32 million to a Burmese Muslim sect of this $1.4 billion. Why aren't the Christians and the Yazidis, who have been identified by the last State Department and this one as suffering from a genocide, why is the money not going to them?
Well, we were hoping that this would get better with the new administration being put in place. We now have a Secretary of State who's been in office for about 6 months. We have a USAID director, Mark Green, who's been there for several months. And it's actually getting worse, Raymond. For 3 years under the Obama administration, $1.4 billion of humanitarian aid went to Iraq for those affected by ISIS.
Okay.
And the Christian church who took care of, Archbishop Warda from the Chaldean Church, whom you know.
Yeah, and he'd been on the program before.
Yeah, he has been the guarantor of the feeding of most of the Christians who survived ISIS and has gotten not a cent of that $1.4 billion in the last 3 years. We hoped it would change with the placement of these new directors of the agencies that distribute aid for the United States government, for the American taxpayer.
It's unbelievable.
And instead, it's gotten worse.
It's unbelievable. And for those who think that this is partisan or we engage in partisanship, when we hit George Bush's administration, you and I, when they were not helping the Christians and these other religious minorities, we hit the Obama administration, and today we're calling out the Trump administration because they're doing something wrong here. $1.4 billion have been dedicated. Why is the State Department farming out taxpayer money to UN relief agencies, Nina, and tell people what that means.
Yeah, what that means is that all of our money, most of our aid money to Iraq for these survivors of ISIS go through the UN. The UN is basically a pass-through. It goes to them, and the U.S. Aid folks cannot leave the consulate compound to actually oversee this reconstruction aid now. And you know, there was a honeymoon for for Secretary Tillerson. I wasn't going to, you know, jump on his performance right away, but it's been 6 months, and we're now at an inflection point where their lands have been liberated by U.S.-led coalition forces. The Christian and Yazidi lands are now free of ISIS. They should be going home, and they can't. They don't have the aid to rebuild their villages. Their villages and towns lack water. They lack power. There are no jobs there except for this rebuilding contracts until things get going, and they can't do, they're not getting anything.
And we see some of the reconstruction happening, the UN doling out funds, but not for these Christian villages. The Christian villages are getting cosmetic reconstruction, like, you know, we're putting a canopy on the mayor's house and we're going to rebuild some municipal buildings. That's actually
in the UN list of projects in the Christian areas, is a canopy on one municipal building in one of the Christian towns. It's pathetic.
It's unbelievable.
And there's a girls' school that the UN has its stamp on the wall outside of it, all over it.
We have pictures of that. Look, we'll show you.
And, you know, the church went in, the church representatives went inside the school and took photographs. It's in shambles. It hasn't been touched since ISIS left it. And it's full of rubble. Its desks are overturned. It's dark. It's unlit. And no one can even walk through it, much less study there.
But why is the administration, the Trump administration and the State Department, allowing the UN to dole out these funds and give people some insight? These Christians are refugees. They're living in camps. Give us the nature of the camps and where they have to go if they want this aid.
Yeah, this is Obama-era policies of giving the money to the UN, or giving our aid, American aid, to the UN. And the UN decides what camps to set up for the displaced, those who fled ISIS and survived. And they decided that they were not going to do any for the Christians. And if the Christians wanted aid, and they only did half for the Yazidis living around one area of Dohuk in Kurdistan. So all the Christians now and all the Yazidis now are in Kurdistan. The UN has no camps whatsoever for the Christians, only half for a portion of the Yazidis. And they say that if you want aid, you've got to go into the majority Muslim camps. Now, these camps, these are tiny minorities, the Christians and the Yazidis. They are ISIS sympathizers. We know that. We can even see that in the migrant camps in Europe. ISIS sympathizers are in those camps, and these Christians would be terrified, are terrified, and avoid them. They're terrified of being trafficked, of being raped, of being forcibly converted, of being held for ransom, which is a favorite target, you know, that they target the Christians with.
So these UN camps are really lousy refugee camps. I mean, they're not they're not protecting the rights of the people in them.
They're good for the majority, but for the minorities that are reviled and targeted, no, they're dangerous places. They can't go there.
So what do you want people to do? There are a lot of Catholics, evangelicals watching. They were rallying behind this administration, and the president himself, when he issued that travel ban several months ago, said he wanted to give a priority to Christians. This has always been part of the campaign promise from the beginning. Why are Christians and these Yazidis and others slipping through the cracks here?
Well, I think that there are two things that can be done in terms of activism. One is to let your elected officials, including the president and vice president, know that the State Department is really creating a situation where the Christians are being driven out of the Middle East. And even though there are a reduced population of Christians over the last 15 years, vastly reduced, 80% have gone already, these that are left are still one of the largest communities of Christians left in the Middle East. So it's important that they stay. They want to stay. So one is to let your elected officials know. And the second thing is to give private aid, the Knights of Columbus, Aid to the Church in Need, Samaritan Purse. Those three organizations are rebuilding houses. Now, again, we need government aid for the big water projects and the electricity, but that is something that everyone can do.
Yeah. Tell me what's happening in the Nineveh Plain. I read a story of an Iranian-built school, you are concerned that the lack of aid and the way the U.S. aid is being dispersed is actually helping Iran colonize these territories.
That's right.
Explain.
It's a colonization process that's going on because and this is why I say that this is even getting worse now, because these villages and towns that belong to the Christians and Yazidis are now vacant. They're mostly vacant. No one is holding that land. And so the Iranian militias who helped defeat ISIS have moved in. They've raised their flags, their sectarian flags, and the government of Iran is blatantly there, starting schools. They had a ribbon-cutting ceremony in one Christian town of Bartella, a famous Christian town, and they had the Iraqi government there, and they had the Iranian government there, and it's a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a school, elementary school, a mosque, and a library.
What does this mean to you? What is the impact of having Iran move into this territory that American blood, sweat, and treasure went into securing and liberating?
Yes, we're delivering over northern Iraq, Nineveh, to our enemy.
What is the State Department saying? Have you had conversations with them?
I have had conversations, and the people who are in charge of giving aid, I've spoken with them, and they say that the church is taking too good care of them. We don't need to give any money. That was one statement.
What?
And I said, well, are you aware that they're all leaving because they're despairing they can't leave the camps? Because the church can't both feed and care for all the, raise the money that it takes to care for all these tens of thousands of people, and then at the same time
rebuild their towns.
Yes, they have to choose one or the other, and they can't send, it's a heartbreaking choice. They can't send them back to their towns without aid.
So you're saying there's a very fixed timeline that's already, the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
You believe how much time do we have to maintain this community, this Christian community there?
It's a race against time.
Yeah, 80% of them are gone. Let's face it.
80% are gone. It's still one of the largest left, even though it is down to about 250,000 now of Christians. And the AID, which is our big aid delivery agency, Director Mark Green is there now. They've said that they don't target religious or ethnic minorities, and I want to know, for heaven's sake, why not? This was a religious genocide, even
identified by your boss and the previous administration as a genocide.
Exactly.
This is a mind-boggling. All of this.
Everything is wrong with this picture.
Yeah. Well, Nino SHEA wrote an incredible piece in the Wall Street Journal this past week. I'm going to put it up on our Facebook and Twitter feeds so you can read that. But thank you for bringing attention to this, and stay in touch and let us know if you get any reaction. It's really important. These people can't speak for themselves. You can follow Nino SHEA at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute by visiting hudson.org. When we return, the late Justice Antonin Scalia speaks. Editors of a new collection of his speeches, Chris Scalia, his son, and Ed Whelan are here to discuss the man behind the legal philosophy when the world over continues. Stay right there.
I attack ideas, I don't attack people, and some very good people have some very bad ideas.
That was, of course, Justice Antonin Scalia. A new Supreme Court session got underway this week with a full complement of justices. And in this first week of October, it's difficult not to think of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who left us a little over a year ago. My next guests are here to give us a glimpse at another side of Nino. They've assembled a collection of some of his finest speeches at commencements, convocations, other events, and it reveals not only his thoughts on the law, but on faith, life, and the American character. It's called Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived. It's edited by my guests, Christopher Scalia, the Justice's son, and Ed Whelan, who clerked for Justice Scalia. Thank you both for being here. I want to start with, we have the Justice's dissents bound. We read so many of his opinions over the years. Why did we need a collection of his speeches, and where did these come from, Christopher?
Well, first, where they came from, Ed and I received a box of hard copy speeches and a box of discs from his offices through the help of his secretary, and we just sorted through them and just probably about 200 speeches total. And we selected the ones, the best of the best. They were all very good. But we selected the ones that we thought would be most interesting to general readers, people who weren't necessarily legal scholars or lawyers or law students or anything like that, but were interested in my father, in his approaches to the law, but wanted to know more about him overall. And I think that's what really sets it apart from the opinions themselves. About 12 of these speeches are about the law, but and he says a lot of the things basically that he says in the opinions, but he says them in more colloquial, I guess, casual fashion, as you do when you deliver speeches. And a lot of these speeches weren't necessarily delivered to legal audiences. And plus, as you mentioned, a lot of the speeches are not about the law. A lot of them he delivered at high school commencements or college graduation ceremonies.
You've got a speech on the arts at
That's
Juilliard
right,
about the First Amendment rights. I mean, there's a lot of diversity. He speaks about faith. It really is a rich assortment of his mind beyond the law. Ed, were these written out fully? Were these notes you all were working from, transcriptions? How did you find these speeches? What condition were they in?
They were written out fully. We were actually amazed to discover this treasure trove. I think we had no idea that he had written so many speeches on such a broad range of topics and with such care. Very few of these speeches have ever been published anywhere before. So the reader will find insights into Justice Scalia's thinking on a whole range of issues that he will not have encountered before.
Christopher, after your dad passed away, I remember reading a piece you wrote in the Washington Post, and it brought to mind what happens with so many of us who write for a living. You have dinner, and then you retreat into your cave.
Right.
That was often what happened with your dad. You would pass the windows and see him working in there.
It was a little bit of a sanctuary. I don't know, I loved walking by there and seeing him hard at work. And as I started to write a little more myself, I started to appreciate that space he had a little bit more. And he writes about that in one of these speeches. He describes the writing process, and he says that basically it comes down to time and sweat. That's what it takes to be a great writer. And he certainly was a great writer because he put so much effort into it.
There's a wonderful line in the book, and I pulled it out because it's a cruel thing that I often think and say on occasion, but I wouldn't have said it quite as succinctly or beautifully as he did. And he said, "I do believe, however, that there is at least this connection between good writing and intellect. It is my experience that a careless, sloppy writer has a careless, sloppy mind." So this is true. Tell me about that process as you witnessed it as a young person and then as an adult. He would take a lot. I mean, these opinions that he wrote were razor sharp. You saw him, Ed, as well, shape his words and spend time. Tell me about that process, the deliberative care he took in shaping not only his opinions, but these speeches as well, each of you.
Well, sure, I could. You'd be in his chambers and you could actually see him sort of physically thinking with his face contorting as he's trying to get just the right phrase, and then the aha moment when he figures out just how he wants to say something. No, for him, as I think for any good writer, writing is hard work. Every word matters, and the whole process of writing is one of thinking through very carefully what you're saying. So he savored that process. He didn't particularly enjoy it, but he enjoyed what came out of it, and worked very hard at it.
What's the Dorothy Parker line? I love to have written, I hate to write.
Yeah, exactly.
I should put that above my office. Yeah. Your experience of how he labored. I know, if I remember right, it's been since your father passed away, but in that piece in the Washington Post, or maybe it was an interview, your mother talks about he would try lines out on her.
Yeah, he would try lines out too with other justices too, and usually or often they were lines that he knew he really couldn't get in there, but he was just kind of he needed to share them. He wanted somebody to hear the line, and my mom would say, "No, you can't use that one," and he said, "I know." But Justice Thomas tells a great story of how often my dad would call him and say, "Clarence, you got to hear this." And he would read a line over the phone and guffaw at the line. And sometimes those ones would stay in. I have memories of my father when he was working on a book, just laboring all summer. And I spent a week with him and my mother at the beach, and he barely left the house. He spent the whole time kind of just in the little study area he had there, working the entire time. I mean, he was serious about it, and he wanted to make sure that the words that he sent out into the public were perfect or as good as possible.
What I love about this collection of speeches is you come away with a real sense of the man. I feel so blessed to have known him. We'd go to Mass at St. Mary's together. I saw him over the years. And that kind of devilish sense of seeing the world and the way he'd express it. He held little back. He was great fun. I remembered as I read this, the opera was a great love of his. He and your mom were always at the Kennedy Center, and he and Justice Ginsburg shared that love of opera. And their friendship I want to talk about in a moment. But I can remember a night, I won't say who was singing, but he and your mom were sitting in front of us, and halfway through the thing, he of course said what we were all thinking, which was it was a really lousy concert. It was new music, and he hated the kind of nouveau stuff. And he kept turning around going, I'm waiting for this thing to start. When is it going to start? Well, then at the end, these two singers came out and did these Neapolitan kind of love songs. And then he said, finally, we get a performance. And then he's applauding. So it just captured, that moment always captures kind of his spirit. Yeah. And he was tapping along and having such a great time. Tell me about that connection, because that was the glue that held he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg together. I mean, they had a friendship. But the opera, the shared love of opera really held them together. And in the book, you all allude, in her introduction, Ruth Bader Ginsburg alludes to his closeness to Justice Kagan, Sotomayor, Ginsburg, people who he didn't agree with on very much, but they were very close friends. Is that missing from the court in his absence?
I know that the justices miss him, but I don't get the impression that that is missing. I think that the court is a family, and that came through very clearly to me, especially after my father passed away, just how supportive the other justices were, especially to my mother. They were just really very, very loving, and so I don't think that has gone away. I think just the nature of that job, it brings people close together, or at least it can. And my father took advantage of that. And he and Justice Ginsburg, for as much as they disagreed, they had a great working relationship too. Right. They would, as she explains in her foreword, they would help each other out a lot with the drafts of their opinions, even though they were on opposite sides. They wanted to make each other's opinions better.
And Ed, how did that work? I mean, you witnessed that up close. They would kind of use each other as almost sharpeners to clarify their thought and challenge their own perspective on a given issue.
Well, they actually forged their friendship when they were both on the D.C. Circuit. The year I clerked for Justice Scalia, Justice Ginsburg hadn't yet joined the court, so I did not see them in action there. But she writes a lot about how they would exchange ideas, and I think they really provide a model for something that's missing in this country, which is a friendship across ideological lines, a capacity to appreciate the good qualities in someone else, even as you have very fundamental disagreements. And they were genuinely friends, along with their spouses. I believe they spend every New Year's Eve together. And again, I think it's a great example that many of us could profit
from. I agree.
Another thing, I just add one more thing that I think bonded them, both the couples, was that my mother and Justice Ginsburg's husband are fantastic cooks. Marty Ginsburg was a great cook, and he and my mother used to love talking about cooking, and so that was definitely a bond in addition to the opera.
What did you learn about your father that you didn't know or appreciate as you looked over this body of his professional life, his speaking, that part of his personality? And he really was a performer.
He was a performer, and that I had known that, and I guess I got a better appreciation of that from reading through the speeches again. One thing that really hit home to me was just how much he loved teaching. And the point of these speeches was to teach. He had been a law professor for much of his career, and he never gave up that enthusiasm for teaching. And to the point to which, he even remembered the names of professors and high school teachers who had been really influential to him, and he mentions a couple of them in his speeches.
Yeah.
He was kind of a born teacher, and even when he wasn't a law professor anymore, he kept teaching by delivering all these speeches.
Ed, what do these speeches tell us about the legal mind of Nino Scalia that perhaps laymen did not fully appreciate? I mean, you're a lawyer, you've been immersed in the court for all these years, but for the layman, it does give you a certain insight. He distills his thought here in a way that's really accessible.
He does, and I think the layman will learn a lot about his approach, about the battle between so-called originalism and the living Constitution.
Right.
But I think what you see here is how his whole approach to the law fit within his broader understanding of what it means to be a judge, what it means to be an American, and also how one reconciles being a judge with being a faithful Catholic.
Right.
He makes quite clear repeatedly that the duty of a judge is not to indulge one's moral or religious beliefs, and he actually, resented it when people would praise him, thinking that he had done so.
Exactly.
That he would say that the one commandment that really applied to his judging was the commandment, "Thou shalt not lie." Thou shalt not lie about the meaning of the Constitution and other laws. But beyond that, his job was to apply the laws that had been enacted through the democratic processes. So he's a big believer in separation of powers and a huge believer in this ongoing American experiment.
The enduring Constitution, as he says here.
That's right.
The enduring Constitution. Not the living, but the enduring.
That's right.
Interesting choice of words. And you make a very good point. Years ago, I begged him for years to sit for an interview. He finally, after saying, okay, I'll send a letter to the chambers, I'll look at it, Raymond. He finally sends me a letter back. He only wrote me one time, and I have it still at home. And he says, I know if I sit down, you're going to try to pin me down to talk about Catholicism, how it relates. I'm going to get lost in a quagmire. I don't want to talk about it. It'll just confuse people. Forgive me. And that's what he said. So, and I have forgiven him, but it is the one regret I have that I never got to interview him. You have a wonderful moment in your introduction you describe at your high school graduation. Your father gets up to speak, but you introduce him first. Tell that story, because I think it gives you an insight to his mind and how he interacted with those he loved.
I had the honor of introducing him at my high school graduation, and I worked hard on writing a clever introduction that also, did the basics of telling people who he was. I wanted to impress my classmates mostly. And I think I pulled it off until all I had to do was say his name. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome. And I mispronounced his name because I don't...
The first name.
Yeah, the first name.
Yeah, I know the last one.
The first name, his first name was Dad to me.
Yeah.
So I stumbled on Antonin, as, in my defense, many people do.
Right.
But usually not his sons. And so I said something like Antonin, and it was terrible. And I was very embarrassed, and I shook his hands, and he began speaking, and he said something like, "Thank you very much," and then he looked at a piece of paper as if to remind himself who I was. And I don't know if he had planned on doing that or if that was a response to my own gaffe or what, but it was pretty funny.
I love in the book, you talk about the Stump Speech. There was a Stump Speech that he would give with regularity, and he'd vary it and play around it, but you could not find a written version of that because he didn't carry one. Tell us what he did carry around.
He carried a one-page outline that had about 50 words on it that looks like you might have scrawled it on a napkin on an airplane. And this was the page he insisted on having with him whenever he would give this speech. Even though you look at it and say, what sort of guideline is this? At some point it says, there ought to be a law, for example.
Cue sheet. It's a cue sheet, so he knows the rest of the thought.
And I think it just triggered so many associations in his mind. Over the years, he just knew that that one thing will lead to another. Again, I think it's like a jazz musician riffing on a theme. I'm sure there were countless variations over the years, very few of which have been recorded. It worked for him, and it's wonderful to have this very short outline.
There's a line that I came across in the book that I loved, where he says, the enduring quality of saying the right thing at the wrong time is the secret to my popularity, which is perfect. What do people miss or get wrong about your father that they might correct in reading this book?
I don't know if they necessarily get this aspect wrong, but I think that people think they kind of know the basics of his approach to interpreting the law, but these speeches give him the opportunity to explain things in more detail than blurbs from an opinion do. And I think that's how most people are familiar with him, just kind of a scathing dissent here and there. In these, especially the legal speeches, he lays things out so clearly, so reasonably, that I think most people who are familiar with him are missing out on the details and the systematic nature of these speeches.
Ed?
I think his admirers and his detractors have different misconceptions. This book will sort all of those out.
Yeah, no, I was fascinated by it and found it really insightful. And I, having known him and read so many of the decisions, you come away with a fuller appreciation of the man. Yeah. It's the difference between a razor and a butter knife. This is the butter knife, and I like that as well. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic book. Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived is available now at bookstores everywhere. Thanks again for being here, both of you. That is all the time we have until next week. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.